Button, and we're live. So welcome to LinkedIn Live, charting your voyage to success. I'm Steve Morris. I'm a professional EOS implementer and help business owners build better lives through building better businesses. And in this LinkedIn Live series, I'm talking with business people who've been in the ring, hearing about the amazing stories, their lives, their careers, what they've learned, and what they would do differently along the way. My guest today is Lawrence Williams. Lawrence is the founder and CEO of Merlin Mobility and chairman of the Merlin Mobility Foundation, which we're going to hear about in this discussion. Lawrence started his career with the US Congress and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And then subsequently, he's worked closely with Elon Musk as a founding executive at SpaceX and an advisor for Tesla Motors, before going on and helping Zipline's autonomous aircraft delivery service in the US. So Lawrence has done a lot. And in 2020, he founded Merlin Mobility to develop advanced technology solutions that make driving easier, safer, and more accessible for all. So Lawrence, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be here. Appreciate your interest and time today.
Yeah, it was good having you on the show here. So you've obviously clearly had a very interesting and varied career. And I was going through that introduction there saying you started off, US Congress and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And then it's sort of like ... And next thing you're sort of advising Elon Musk. So there must have been something in the middle there, or, what was that path look like?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And yes, there was a couple of things I did in between. So when I graduated from CU Boulder, where we're both based, although I had started off studying computer science, ended up majoring in political science. And so Washington, D.C. seemed like the place to go, but I still had very much an interest in technology and ended up working for a member on the Science-Based Technology Committee and then subsequently for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration that you mentioned, which also coincidentally has a lab in Boulder. And I realized fairly quickly that I really wasn't cut out for the amount of bureaucracy there was in federal government, even though I think they're incredibly important jobs and doing really important work, and decided to leave there. And it was the first time where I was really thinking in my career about what was important to me and what I wanted to do next. And I really had this instinct that I wanted to work for a smaller company where I could have a bigger impact. And at the time, to date myself, we're talking about the early 1990s. And it was really in the early days of the emergence of the internet and the World Wide Web. And there was a company launched called Teledesic, which was funded by one of the major entrepreneurs in the wireless sector named Craig McCaw and funded by Bill Gates. And the plan was to circle the globe with low Earth orbiting satellites and provide broadband access anywhere on the planet, including boats. And it was something that was probably ahead of its time. I remember having to answer the questions like, why would we ever need broadband? Why would we ever need more than 28.8 kilobits per second? Because again, this was really early days. And my job was to go around the world and get access to the radio frequencies to operate the system, which we did. We were very successful working through the International Telecommunications Union and the World Radio Conferences, and then bilaterally with different countries. But it was the aerospace sector just hadn't really evolved enough to really support the building out of this system. This was, again, in the 1990s when most of the aerospace sector was dominated by federal government contracts. Right. And those tended to be very expensive. And so when the internet bubble burst, as well as the satellite bubble, companies like Iridium and Globalstar that had been kind of the forerunners in this new world of low Earth orbiting satellites, when those happened, ultimately the company I was working for liquidated, and I decided it'd be a good time for me to go back and get an MBA at business school, which I did at Georgetown. And it was during that time period, actually even, I guess I had heard about Elon and SpaceX before I started, I guess while I was in business school, before I had left ICO, which was the company. And ultimately just realized that Elon was another visionary like Craig McCaw, seemed like a really interesting guy with very ambitious plans and a chance to potentially get involved early. And so I got my resume to Elon, and he initially hired me to is a consultant to find spectrum for a future satellite system, which today is what Starlink is evolving into. And just again, to put some timeline on it, this was 2003 when I started working with them. And of course, Starlink is just now rolling out all these years later. So really hats off to Elon for so many different reasons in terms of being a visionary and the foresight. But even back in 2003, when the company had yet to even launch its first rocket, he was already thinking about ultimately the future of the revenue of the company would be likely based on a satellite system.
Yeah. Wow. What a fascinating path, this journey that you've been on, and to see these things that you've been involved in, 20, 30 years ago, that was so, having that vision, which was so far ahead of the time, and really, the capability of the technology, I guess, right, to be able to get those things really brought to market. And now here we are, 20, 30 years later, and they are all rolling out, and private space, exists, and people are putting things into orbit to be able to do all this stuff. So it's incredible to see how far back those ideas, sort of have the genesis, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. The low Earth orbiting satellites, other than at least for communication, really had not been a big part of the communications landscape until really Iridium was one of the very first, which was a Motorola company, and had the sort of vision, but ultimately had its own constraints. It's still operating today, but to be able to understand that it could be used to provide broadband internet access is something that has it was seen as very interesting then in the 90s, and then there was a point where people had kind of written it off as it'll never happen. The economics don't make sense. But again, hats off to Elon for having that foresight and fortitude, and really ultimately, obviously, opening up space and really launching an entire new industry of commercial satellite in space, and it's amazing how things have changed.
Right. So when you look back over your, that time period, and so you're working on these leading edge technologies and things, and what do you sort of really see as like your greatest accomplishments in that time, the things that you look back on and you're like, really proud of the things that you were involved in and things you did then?
Yeah, that's a great question. The work we did at Teledesic, which was definitely a pioneer in the low Earth orbit space, with getting support at the World Radio Conferences. The International Telecommunication Union is an interesting subculture of basically how radio frequencies are coordinated, because radio frequencies obviously go beyond a country's border. So that multilateral negotiation that happens in a not only a UN style, but the United Nations is basically hosts these World Radio Conferences. So you're working with governments, and it's a really interesting world where industry and governments come together, and the governments are representing their own individual industries and trying to negotiate. That was definitely, really excited to be part of that and kind of learn how that world works. I had not done that much international business at that point in my career, and of course, just being along for the ride with Elon and SpaceX, just to have been there in the early days, to see Elon's conviction to the vision, and really the goal of lowering the cost of access to space as being the necessary precursor to this entire opening up of space again. Just incredible vision and execution and granular focus. And so it was really incredible to be a part of that team.
Right. Yeah, and so, you sort of these days, obviously Elon is just this larger than life character, right? On the internet, there's a lot of memes around his leadership, and you're talking about, his vision being so far ahead of the time. One of the big things that we talk about in EOS is you can have all the vision you want, but vision without traction is hallucination, is sort of one of the, sayings that we have in EOS. And so it's this ability to be able to take a vision and, bring it down to the ground and actually execute that seems to be so incredible watching Elon.
Yes. It's definitely visionary doesn't sum up anywhere close to really what Elon has accomplished.
Yeah, because he has the execution piece as well, which is not always, something you find, together. You can have the, the pie in the sky visionary, but to have somebody who can actually really make it happen.
Yes, at a very granular level.
So what do you think his secret sauce is in that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there is any simple answer to that question. I think he does, as I mentioned, get very granular into the details. Big believer in bringing things back to first principles. In a lot of the industries in which he's worked, and this is probably true in every industry, but definitely more true in some than others, like aerospace and automotive, because of the incredible amount of capital required, that there is a high propensity and a lot of momentum and inertia around the way things have been done. And it is, I think a lot of times people overestimate the ability of incumbents to innovate and underestimate the amount of inertia in constraints and shackles to the way things have been done that prevent them from innovating. So that's one of the, visionary and Elon's name get tossed around a lot, but the reality is Elon was far from the first person who wanted to start a rocket company to help open up space. He was not the first person by a long shot to make a decision to get into the electric car business. Obviously, the automotive industry had done it and tried and failed, or some people say intentionally failed, but regardless, it never took off like he showed it. And in terms of what I saw in like the autonomous vehicle world was sort of a similar missing incremental step. So as I was just talking about with space, plenty of companies have tried to launch new rockets. And really, I think Elon's genius was figuring out what is that incremental first market step where he can get traction. He didn't just go out, even though his goal clearly was to make humans a multiplanetary species, figure out a way to terraform Mars, launch people to go to Mars. He didn't start out building Starship to go to Mars. He started out with the Falcon 1, which is really what his sort of conviction was around a minimum viable product. And it wasn't launching people into space, which some other competitors have tried to do and some are doing. His point was, where's the only real proven revenue stream of putting things in space really on a commercial basis was satellites. And so that's why he built the Falcon 1, to be a small satellite launch vehicle. Similarly, with Tesla, we used to get this question a lot. We, meaning me with him in meetings. And he clearly got into one of the things that was driving his interest in electric vehicles was global warming. And the question would be a lot of times, how are you, Tesla, going to ever make a difference in global warming when you're contract manufacturing $100,000 sports cars at the tune of like 2,000, which is all the Tesla Roadsters that were built. And his point was, you got to start where you are. And the company Tesla didn't have $1 billion. They couldn't start manufacturing new cars. So they did the only thing they could do, which is, again, what's the minimal viable product that's going to make a difference in the market, get traction. And it was the Roadster. And with that, he was then able to parlay that to build the Model S, which was a huge, huge jump. And then the Model X, and then obviously the Model 3 and Model Y. And I mean, the rest is history. But that's what when I was looking at the autonomous vehicle space, that what seemed to be missing a lot of focus on what I would say is like going to Mars, which is building a robo-taxi that works anywhere in the world, or an autonomous vehicle that works anywhere in the world. And what I saw is the real problem that needed to be solved is that driving is a critical function. Access to transportation is a critical function for people to live independent lives. There's a lot of people out there who would really like nothing more than to be able to drive, but they have difficulty driving safely. We still lose 1.3 million lives lost on our roads every year. Could we use the technology, instead of replacing drivers, to just make it safer and easier for people to drive who might not be able to drive at all? And so that is really the genesis of Merlin Mobility. And what we see is, again, a minimum viable product, sort of the equivalent of a Tesla Roadster for the autonomous vehicle industry. Again, nothing against the companies that are out there trying to build robo-taxis. I mean, it's amazing technology. they're raised and are spending billions of dollars, and it's incredible. And actually, we're able to benefit off a lot of those investments. But we're trying to solve a significantly different problem that we think is a real problem in the market, which is for people that live in a smaller town like Boulder or outside of really the most densely populated urban centers. How can you help them continue to drive in their own vehicles?
Right. Yeah, and you'd mentioned when we'd first talked and met about this sort of concept of, people own cars for 10, 12 years. And so it's going to take a long time before we get to that sort of Mars level technology, filtering all the way through the population. So, you've sort of seen these lessons of how, you've been able to really engage with a new industry and like make progress. And now you're bringing that same sort of vision to the driving world and being able to figure out, so what can we do now with the technology we have now, with taking one step at a time. So tell me a little bit more about that. So your first product is something that you're going to come and retrofit, aftermarket fit into an existing vehicle.
Yes, that's our focus. And one of the things that I learned, you mentioned the company Zipline that I worked with that was using autonomous drones to deliver healthcare products. Really, one of their keys to success was not trying to boil the ocean. And they ultimately tried to find a more constrained environment in the autonomous industry. They call it operational design domain, which is a fancy term for basically what the environment you're operating in, the constraints around it. And for Zipline, they went to a country called Rwanda. It's a relatively small country in Africa. And it wasn't because they didn't have regulations and they didn't have the same challenges we have in the United States, but the airspace is a lot less congestion. And they focused on delivering from, on fixed paths. So they started out with just from, point A to point B, much easier to coordinate that with the safety regulatory agencies and to really constrain that design domain to do something that is far less complex. And I felt like that same kind of model could be used in driving, and taking advantage of the fact that most people tend to drive those same routes over and over again. And most of the autonomous vehicle focus was really falling into two areas: either robo-taxis that were focused on densely populated urban centers, or trying to build into new cars, the automotive industry, these sort of capabilities, which are still many years away. And the automotive industry really has to sell a solution that is going to work everywhere, that regulators are going to be able to approve on a pretty much a global scale. And there's a lot that has to evolve there. The safety regulatory agencies are very conservative, and at the same time, solving for these edge cases is very complex. And even having the liability around who's responsible for accidents is something that is going to have to evolve as well, because right now the driver is clearly the one responsible for any accidents that happen, whether you're an Uber driver or you're driving your own personal vehicle. And as soon as a company like Uber is operating its own fleet, I think it stands to reason that Uber takes on that liability, or the automotive industry, if they sell you a car that is self-driving, that's something that still has to be tackled. And from our perspective, we call it, our tagline is autonomy for people who drive. We are helping people drive in an adapted way, in the same way that vehicles have been adapted for decades for people with special needs. And that's in many ways kind of our niche target market, or special needs, and then evolving that to people who, just want to automate their commute to work, for example. In more rural suburban areas, it's a more greatly constrained environment, more akin to basically like operating in Rwanda, if you will.
So, at the moment, most cars, I was just rented a car last week, which, has all of the sort of the lane keeping, warning stuff happening, and trying to, parallel park it was a bear, because all these warning signals are constantly going off as I'm trying to get close to the car behind, when you're in a packed urban environment and things. Some of those sort of technologies I feel need to, they still need to evolve in terms of, being a little bit more human friendly. But then, at the top end of it, you were talking about these sort of edge cases too. And unfortunately, I sort of see we in this society where edge cases, those end up on the front page of the newspaper, right? Because we can get a nice big dramatic story out of it.
Yeah, despite the fact that we're, thousands of people dying, every day in automobiles, if it involves this new technology, it becomes, like you said, a front page story.
All right. So in the middle there, you are just sort of trying to quietly shift the needle and go beyond just, lane keeping warnings and parallel parking warnings and things, but actually making the driving experience a safer one, without getting out there and, being the edge case.
Yep. It's definitely a more evolutionary approach. And I do believe that autonomous driving has the potential to be safer than humans driving, but there's a long way to get there. And part of the challenge is that you've got, you're trying to integrate autonomous vehicles into an entire evolution of the regulation, and the fact that our roads are dominated by human drivers who are responsible for seeing and avoiding other vehicles. And ultimately, when you mix those two, is often where things get more complicated. So we're looking at a much more evolutionary approach to help drivers drive more safely. And it's using some things, like you mentioned, everything from forward collision warning to lane keeping to auto steer, and it's very similar technology that's out there, but with the way we're utilizing it, and our proprietary version of it is unique.
Yeah. It sounds amazing. So, you founded Merlin Mobility in 2020. So you're the second year in now. And so what does the sort of path forward look from here?
Yeah, well, we're starting to do pilots, and we're testing, working with some partners we've been in conversations with, pretty advanced, both with driving schools, driving instructors, the insurance industry, some potential fleet operators, and ultimately just proving out what is our working prototype and getting to the initial commercialization, which we plan to do in 2022. And we believe we can not only be very successful from a business perspective, but also importantly help people avoid a lot of accidents, car crashes, as well as save lives.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a very relevant story. I mean, somebody I was just talking to very recently was talking about one of their parents, is over the age of 90, who had got into an accident and things like that. And I know that's one of the things that you're trying to prevent happening, right?
Well, yeah, and we look at it from really empowering older adults. I definitely was inspired watching my parents, who want nothing more than to be able to continue to drive, but drive safely. And obviously, children want them to be able to drive safely. So if there's something that we can do to support them in that, and ultimately it's a technology that could help everyone, but we really look at where's the highest value add, and it's going to be with older adults and team drivers and people that might have some sort of disability, as well as people that are just, again, looking to make their commute easier and safer.
Mm-hmm. So what do you sort of see as, the biggest challenge that you have right in front of you? What are you dealing with right now? the biggest obstacle in your way?
Yeah, a lot of it is just really focusing on really our go-to-market strategy, getting those first channel partnerships in place in a way that where interests are aligned, and going to market and making sure that the technology is robust and reliable. And we're just at that really important inflection point of a company.
A lot's going to be happening then, huh? In the next 12 months.
Absolutely.
Getting all that proven out.
Yeah. Yep.
So as you look back, and you can choose the timeline for this question that I'm going to ask, but, what do you know now that you wished you had known, at some previous point in your career? So I don't know if you wanted to say what you know now that you wished you'd known back at the beginning of 2020, or, even further back. Like what are some of the important lessons that you're learning along the way?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. A couple of thoughts come to mind, especially when I think back to starting on Capitol Hill and in government and what I thought about then. One of the things that I think has helped my success, but I think it's also been something that I wish that I would have had a broader perspective on. I've been often, I think, pretty good at figuring out what are the things that I need to know, and really, focusing on the things that I need to know and remaining focused on really what my goals were and objectives. But I also look back and I think about the kind of missed opportunities that I might have had I had a broader perspective of really looking at every meeting that I had and every conversation that I had is a learning opportunity. Even though we go into a lot of meetings like, oh, this, we might be included on a group Zoom or a group meeting, and we think, oh, this really isn't that important to me, and not even sure why I need to be there. And Elon actually has an axiom that, like, if you're ever called to a meeting and you realize, part way through the meeting that you don't need to be there, then leave. Mm-hmm. Go do something that's more valuable in your time. And he really promotes that. And I think for me, while I agree with that perspective, I do think sometimes, number one, your boss isn't going to be that way, and you can't just get up and walk out of a meeting. And so I've tried to take looking back, think of like some of the missed opportunities I had to be in a meeting, for example, with some of the world's greatest like rocket engineers, and realize like this is an incredible learning opportunity for me, even though I don't need to know how to build a rocket,
right,
or build the rocket engine, or build a composite, and understand, and that's really one of the keys to Elon's success is I think every meeting he was granular, and he was trying to understand exactly what the problems of whoever he was meeting with, whether it be an engineer or somebody helping on the business development side, and really just delving into the details and learning that and helping to solve that problem, even if, because I think from his perspective, every issue was his issue.
Yeah, so he's building, a neural network, right? And just sort of like pulling together all of this information. And I agree. I think it's sometimes we wonder, like, what are we doing in life, and, whether or not something is relevant or, on the path to our goals and things. But, I feel like life does have a sort of a more of a circular path to it sometimes. And, particularly designing sailboats, right? There's no straight lines or anything on it. Everything's a curved surface, and it's all about how things flow. And so I certainly can understand. I think, being in some of the incredible meetings that you've been in your career, and just like the knowledge that you've been exposed to along the way, right? And all of that has been assimilated there, right? It may not be top of mind, but it's there.
Yeah. And I definitely think back to times where I, again, missed opportunities to really have dove in more and really tried to understand, even things that were not part of my job suite, to just say, hey, this is an opportunity to learn from whoever is talking, and really take full advantage of that.
Yeah. And you never know when these sort of, I think the human mind works in very mysterious ways at times. You can sometimes be like wandering around, can't find your car keys because they're straight in front of you. And at other times, something will come out of your unconscious that's like, oh my gosh, I've just realized, you have that, moment of inspiration, right?
Yep.
I love the way the mind works. Yeah. So, well, awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time this morning, Lawrence. I really appreciate it. And, it's been incredibly interesting to learn about, all the things that you've been involved in along your career. So Merlin Mobility, how can people find out more about what you're doing and get in contact with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. Yeah, our website is drivemerlin, MERLIN.com. Okay. And we're definitely starting to grow our team, and always looking for partnerships, obviously customers, and would love to stay in touch. My email is Lawrence, LAWRENCE @drivemerlin.com. And really appreciate your interest, and thanks for all the work that you do to help people succeed.
All right. Awesome. Well, great talking with you, Lawrence. Appreciate it. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to reading about you in a good way on the front page of the Wall Street Journal.
My pleasure, Steve. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. All right. Take care. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.